Chairman Craven and the honorable members of the Judiciary Committee, I appreciate the opportunity to share my testimony with you tonight. I am here in my official capacity as the Superintendent of the Rhode Island State Police and the Director of Public Safety for the state of Rhode Island, and as a representative of Governor Raimondo's administration. I am a responsible gun owner, an NRA member, and I believe in the Second Amendment. I've used firearms for most of my life and started at an early age. I shoot recreationally, and I compete occasionally. Some of the guys I compete against are in yellow shirts in the back. I have a concealed carry permit from the Rhode Island Attorney General that I obtained when I retired from the state police in 2015 and became a town manager. I am not naive. I understand this is a complex, tough issue, and there's no easy solution, no easy answers to this. I've seen the good side of responsible firearms ownership, and I've also seen the bad side. I've been shot at by armed robbery suspects with stolen firearms in 1991. I've had stolen firearms pointed at me in 1994 and again in 2003. And as a SWAT commander, I've seen more murder-suicides than I ever care to remember. Last year, I served with Dr. Manni as the co-chair of the Rhode Island Working Group on Gun Safety and was tasked by providing Governor Raimondo with a series of recommendations to make Rhode Island communities safe from gun violence. Over several months, I joined public and behavioral experts, educators, state officials, legal experts, and other members of law enforcement in developing a comprehensive set of suggestions for improving our state's gun laws. While the group didn't always agree on the proposals we considered, all of the proposals in the final report were evaluated extensively, and I believe that they represent the right way forward for making Rhode Island communities safer and even better places to live. The working group's recommendations had exactly one goal in mind: making our communities safer. But it's also important to say that there's another important reason to consider the working group's proposals. Reasonable restrictions on guns can also protect law enforcement personnel working in the line of duty. Our police officers are the state's first line of defense. We owe it to them to ensure that when we send them in harm's way, we've done everything we can do to protect them. I want to thank you for allowing me to provide my testimony this evening. I'd like to thank Governor Raimondo and Attorney General Peter Neronha for their leadership on this complex issue, and I thank the General Assembly for their support from the Rhode Island State Police. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel. Any questions for Colonel Manni from the committee? Yes, Representative, please.
Colonel, are you familiar with the 300-foot concealed carry ban legislation that's been submitted?
Yes, Representative.
Did you hear my earlier question to the sponsor about a law-abiding concealed carry permit holder just driving down a road, and if they're pulled over within that 300-foot radius of a school? As the commander of the state troopers, if this legislation was passed, would you allow your troopers any discretion in enforcing that 300-foot radius ban on firearms?
Representative, the law is the law, and as written, we would have to enforce it. But I do have some concern as if that were the case where a school is very close to a roadway that's traveled by people who, law-abiding citizens going somewhere, so that is something I think we'd have to work out.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, Joe.
He's one more.
Oh, you want one more? Okay.
In the same concern with the 300-foot radius, again, a parent just commuting, going to pick up their child. I mean, that's another primary concern about this. I mean, there's a difference between being inside the school at an event versus just commuting through to pick up your child at school. So again, I would imagine the answer is the same.
Yes, Mr. Representative.
Thank you, Colonel.
Representative Almeida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Colonel.
Mr. Representative.
And I know the state police are going to be okay, so I'm sure glad to see you here today.
Thank you very much, sir.
Earlier, I'm sure you heard about Marsha brought up the issue about teachers carrying guns. You're right, you got to enforce the law, but how do you feel about a teacher carrying a gun in the classroom?
So that's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked that. I am a law enforcement officer, but I'm also a parent, and I was a municipal leader. And I thought I knew the answer at one point, but I think I know it now. I'll get right to the point. I think interjecting a firearm into schools would be a recipe for a disaster. I really do. I'll speak to two different ways in why I think that. As a law enforcement officer, I know the training I've been through, and I know the training my fellow brothers and sisters in law enforcement have gone through. At a minimum of 100 hours of basic firearms training, advanced firearms training, and then 20 to 40 more hours of scenario-based training, shoot, don't shoot, active shooter training, where we're trained to determine what the biggest threat is. As a SWAT team commander, one of my biggest concerns was getting called to an active shooter or a mass shooter in a public place. And that not only having to address that, but having someone with a concealed weapon permit behind those walls that thought they meant good, but then when law enforcement officers were rushing in from all directions, some wearing plain clothes, that there'd be a crossfire. I have experienced that tunnel vision. A law enforcement officer that is faced with a threat, a firearm, immediately goes right to the threat. You can't even see the person you're looking at. You're looking at the threat. That is a common training issue. Let me speak as a municipal leader, as a Narragansett town manager. I met with the superintendent of schools in Narragansett, a man I trust immensely, Dr. Peter Cummings, and he calls it as he sees it. I asked him, what do you think of firearms in schools? His answer exactly to me was 1,000% no. I said, okay. And he's an open-minded guy. Representative McEntee, you know him. So I asked him why. He said, Jim, there are children in that school with restraining orders, no contact orders, custody disputes, anxiety issues, mental health issues. I asked him what other superintendents thought. He said the vast majority were dead set against firearms in schools. Then we had some outreach to the parents and students, as well as the superintendent, where I went as the municipal leader and the police chief went next to me, Chief Corrigan. We asked the teachers, we asked the students, we asked the parents. Not one in all the events we went to said, I think it's a good idea. There's a risk versus benefit. Yes, if you interject a firearm into school, I think the risk greatly outweighs the benefit. So the question I asked myself was, so who are we doing this for? Are we doing it for the people that have the concealed weapon permits, or are we doing it for the people that are in the schools? I hope I answered your question.
I had a whole bunch, but you answered them all, Colonel. And I sure do appreciate your honesty from being able to balance your heart from your head, and we really appreciate that. So I hope that answers helps everybody else up here as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Representative.
Any other questions? Yes, Camille. Oh, I'm ready to have first.
Colonel, thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you,
Could
ma'am.
you please tell me, what is the average response time for a 911 call to a domicile, please? If there is such
To
thing
a
as...
domicile or a school?
No, to a domicile.
I don't know that exact answer, ma'am. I can only know like the communities I served. So if you're in a community like Exeter, where there's no police department and just relying on a handful of state police patrol in the area, the response time would be slower, for sure. If you're talking about an area such as Providence, and I'd let the commissioner answer that directly, I would imagine the response time is very quick. But let's talk about Narragansett, a place that I studied that response time. So you have South Kingston, close proximity, Narragansett as well. The response time is very fast, where police officers would respond to anything. Within 1 to 2 minutes, most responses would be, police officers would be there as a response time.
I'd like to bring your attention to the safe storage bill. Are you familiar with that bill?
I am in concept.
Okay. So we're looking at, hold on.
Safe storage of a firearm.
A firearm,
Yes.
right. It was introduced this evening. I believe that it was one of Representative Caldwell's bills. And the concern that I have is that it places another restriction on responsible gun owners that might be in a situation where they need quick access to the tool to protect themselves in the event of a break-in. And I could tell you from a very personal point of view that I was living in Cranston at the time, and I had 4 young adults who were trying to break into the duplex that I was living in. My husband was on 3rd shift. He was a policeman in Newport at the time, and I was with my son, who was 7 years old. And by the time I called 911, I had already gotten my Mossberg, brought it to the door, and pumped it before the police ever came up to see what the problem was. I mean, if I hadn't had the tool available to me, I think they would have made their way right through the door. And I don't know what would have happened, to be honest with you. So I think requiring that you have, I mean, I'm an NRA member, same as you. I've gone through NRA training. I'm a retired military person. I've gone through firearms training as well. As a responsible gun owner, we are taught the safe way to store the firearm. But if I had to go to a place in the house and unlock it first, again, I don't know that I would be here today to tell the story to you.
So first, thank you for your service to our nation. Second, would you like to be a state trooper? You sound pretty qualified. So that, in that specific example, I would agree with you. But I've also, I had a close friend who was a police officer that kept a loaded firearm unsecured in a house, and I caught one of my nephews about to grab it and hold it. So for every instance like that, you could have an instance like I witnessed. I have many firearms. I only keep one loaded firearm, and that's only recently I carry this firearm, and I keep that loaded in my house, but it is secured. I truly believe a firearm should be secured in a house. There is story upon story of young children and adults that should not be touching these firearms, getting them and doing harm to themselves or someone else. I think there's a balance.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, you have a question? Dennis?
Hi, Colonel.
Hello, Representative.
We both have something in common.
Dennis,
I have 30 years
mic
of,
up.
30 years of law enforcement experience.
And we're both bald? Is that another thing in common, or?
My brother was a lieutenant on the Rhode Island State Police.
I know your brother, yes.
I'll ask you the same question that I asked earlier. You know, the problem in the schools is not the concealed carry holder. And can you answer the question why we're addressing something that isn't a problem?
Yes. There are different levels of people that have concealed weapon carry permits. I've trained many of them. I've qualified many of them. So, quite honestly, one of the things we addressed in this working group was the qualifications to get a concealed carry permit. And quite honestly, I feel that they're very substandard. There's a difference between qualifying with a handgun and training with one. And the qualification is the easy part. And the standard is very low. It's less than 70% scores, hits on target to get successfully qualify. But the training is not there, sir. It's not.
Yep.
If the training was there, where we were teaching people, holding them to a very high standard of a class on safety, security of the firearms, securing the firearms, on active shooter training, decision shooting, night firing, all the stuff police officers must train every single year by law, then maybe that would be a different discussion. But in all due respect, a good percent of the people that have concealed carry permits are not trained for the type of scenarios that we're talking about, especially in schools. You being a police officer know what I'm talking about. Any police officer that's been involved in a critical incident knows how fast it happens, how violent it is, and then how many rounds actually miss the target, even with the most highly trained people firing. So that's the concern I have.
If we were to pass this law today, do you think it would stop the next school shooting tomorrow?
Mr. Representative, if I knew how to stop the next school shooting, I'd be in Washington right now testifying.
Right, but
That is the goal. No, sir, I don't know if it would stop the next school shooting, but once again, I go back to this risk versus benefit. I think the risk, I don't mean to interrupt you, I'm
Go ahead,
sorry.
go ahead.
I think the risk of interjecting a firearm into a school, the chance of it being taken from a pocketbook, being stored improperly, a student getting at it, being stored on a desk, a janitor carrying one in, misplacing it, I think the risk of that is much greater than an active shooter coming into a school and engaging them.
I agree. But I'm going back to the law-abiding concealed carry holder who knows how to use a firearm. First of all, I'll reiterate, it's never been an issue. And I get the point where, when we respond to a call at a school, you don't know who the shooter is, you see the guy with the gun. But, maybe I'm thinking like a cop, but if there's a shooter on the school and I got my firearm on me and I take out the shooter, the first thing I would do is set my gun down because I knew there'd be responding officers and so forth. I'm not sure someone else would do that, but my thought is, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you're a concealed carry holder and you're on school property, God forbid something happens, and that person draws that weapon, she's making a big decision, okay, to take their own life in their own hands, whether it be getting shot by police or getting shot by the shooter. But my point is, they are our first line of defense. They're there. They can take out the shooter before that shooter takes out 10 more kids. And there's pros and cons, I guess you could say, on either side of it. But I go back to my original statement that the concealed carry holder has never been the problem. If it has, then we're addressing the issue, but we're not addressing the issue. And that's what I can't wrap my head around.
Mr. Representative, I heard you say that before to one of the other witnesses, and I understand your opinion. I respect it, but I respectfully disagree with it as well. I think that we cannot pass a law post something only. That just because it didn't happen yet doesn't mean it won't happen. People ask all the time, what's the biggest threat to public safety or law enforcement? And not being prepared for all of the above is the biggest threat. And I think we do need to be prepared for anything that could happen with a concealed carry permit holder bringing a firearm into a school.
Okay, well, I guess I'll just end with, I don't see how that would prevent the next school shooting. Everybody wants to keep the kids safe. I think this is going to put people in harm's way. And you know something? I said it before. If a concealed carry holder pulls out that weapon, it's an open ticket. He or she has got to know that their life can be taken in a split second. But you know something? If they can stop one child's life, we're ahead of the game. But we might disagree on that, but that's my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Representative Norette?
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, Colonel. Again, congratulations on your
Thank you,
appointment. Retired law enforcement, 20 years of Coventry. Could you tell me, annual qualifications for the Rhode Island State Police, how many times a year do the officers qualify or the troopers qualify?
Well, by state law, you have to qualify once and train once, one more additional time. If I remember correctly, the law was passed in 1997, and it was I think it requires 100 rounds fired yearly, of which at least 50 are in training, not just qualifications. So to answer your question, our goal is to shoot at least twice a year.
Okay, so twice a year. And again, I just heard you testify to the training of law enforcement versus a concealed carry permit holder. How often did you, as a town manager, go to the range?
A lot. I go every week.
So the average concealed carry permit holder or advocate of guns goes to the range more often and trains more than the average police officer because the requirements and the budgetary constraints of a police department only require 100 rounds per year.
Well, I would disagree with that statement. Like I said, if you look at it just on an annual basis, maybe that statement would be true. But once again, I go back to the basic 40-hour block of firearms training, the 40 hours of advanced firearm training, and another 20 to 40 hours of complex scenario-based shooting. But that's just shooting. That's just firing the pistol that I'm speaking about with you. But also, we go through in-service training. We go through a 40-hour block every year. We're addressing mental health issues, domestics, a multitude of things.
But we're not discussing like mental health advocacy and training. We're discussing proficiency with guns and firearms. And I know as a police officer, I shot 100 rounds a year. After the academy and after going to the FBI firearms instructor school, where I became an instructor, after that, it was 100 rounds a year throughout my career. So I wouldn't disagree with you that the training for the concealed carry could be bolstered, but I would also agree with you that the training requirements should be bolstered for law enforcement requiring more than 100 rounds a year. Would you agree?
I would like to have it much more than that, but there are requirements, and it really doesn't come down to the ammo, and it comes down to the time required to get police officers off the road and up there and qualify. It's a very labor-intensive, expensive proposition. But I will say 100 rounds a year is a good balance. It used to be a lot less than that. We've come a long way.
Again, I understand, and thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Representative, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Most compelling argument I've heard tonight, Colonel, that you've made on this issue revolves around the tactical scenario. And it brought up two situations that I ran into in Iraq. You know, one where my gunner, well, not my gunner, my lieutenant's gunner accidentally, or I wouldn't say accidentally because he meant to do it, but he wound up killing a friendly. It was an Iraqi National Guard member, but again, didn't know. The guy was on the street, he had a gun. It's like you said, I see gun, I shoot. It's just, it's that process. It's the, I believe, what's the term you used? It's the
Muscle memory?
muscle, but the blinders.
Tunnel vision.
Thank you, the tunnel vision. And then I can also remember a situation where I was in a wood line in full uniform, and someone in a convoy heard a pop and decided to saturate the wood line I was in, as I was clearly visible, with firearms. And the thing I can't get over is, how do you differentiate between a retired officer or a plainclothes officer in that tactical situation? And I would wonder if you would rethink, based on the scenario you presented, the exemption given, if we're going to bring this thing to its full extent. And my understanding is one of your primary concerns is blue on blue, for lack of a better term.
That's correct.
If we're going to bring this to its full conclusion, then I would recommend rethinking the exemption for anybody. Because quite frankly, if you're not in a uniform and you have a firearm and your tactical team is sweeping through a school, they shouldn't have any questions in their minds as to whether or not they should or should not engage. And I would just, again, I don't agree with the legislation. I'm not making an argument for this legislation. But if this legislation, our responsibility is to make this legislation better, if it can be, to continue your full argument to go to its full course, the exemption for law enforcement and retired officers in plain clothes, I believe, would have to be something that would have to be removed from this legislation. I don't know. I guess the question is, would you agree or disagree on that?
Well, first off, again, thank you for your service. My son's a veteran. My father's was a war veteran. So that debate went on with us as well. Retired law enforcement, active duty law enforcement, who should be allowed to carry, who should not be allowed to carry in. That was split on that question, but I think that a modern law enforcement officer has had that blue-on-blue training you're talking about, where we're trying to really avoid this friendly fire. So it was a compromise, and I would support a retired law enforcement officer carrying a firearm, same as an active duty.
Any further questions of the Colonel? Yes, Jimmy.
Congratulations, Colonel, of your appointment.
Thank you, Mr.
I'd like to
Representative.
ask one question. In the schools, right now, they have resource officers. Are they armed?
Yes, sir. So a resource officer, Narragansett, the 3 schools, we have 2 resource officers where I was. They are armed. A resource officer, by definition, is a police officer
Yes.
carrying a firearm.
Yes.
Just a
Okay.
different title.
I just wanted to ask that question. Thank you. So we do have armed police officers in some of the schools?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Carol?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Colonel, I have to congratulate you again, and we surely miss you in Narragansett, you know that. But thank you for your testimony today. You were spot on. I'm so proud of you. I don't know what to say, but thank you.
You're my biggest fan, Representative McEntee.
you know I am.
You always were.
But
Thank you.
thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Yes, Dan.
Colonel, I want to also offer my thanks, but I want to point out it wasn't the baldness between you, Rep. Canary, it was your dashing handsomeness that
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Representative.
Is that a lawyer or is that a lawyer?
He's
huh?
good. He's good.
Canario paid me $20.
It's a Rhode Island lawyer. Joe?
I don't have no questions for you. I really don't. But there were things that I was taught in the Marine Corps that you never forget. I've been going a long time. And I'm sure you know I wore a uniform again, and I have the greatest commissioner sitting right back there, so I appreciate you. But to my brothers up here and everybody up here, some things you don't forget. Can I prove it? I guess the only way you can prove it is when it happens. The major thing of all, I got your back. I hold my ground. I don't back up. Probably that's why I got this damn thing for today, but that's okay. Colonel, I'm sure glad that you're here. And now you're in front of us. I'm sure you'll be back again, and I look forward to it, you coming back. All the training that we are taught, the key word is scenario. You don't know. So imagination, and please correct me, because I'd rather be wrong than right, because I'm not where you're at now. But the key word is scenario, everybody. You don't know what's going to happen. And because you don't know what's going to happen in a school, because you don't know whether or not something's going to happen somewhere where you're at. Case in point in Providence, the SWAT team, well, I forget what you call them now, but the SWAT team did a great job because of training and because of scenarios. I support the bill, only because I don't know. And I look forward to you coming back here again. I appreciate your opinion. I appreciate the fact when you just said, as a parent, that means a lot, at least to somebody like me that did wear a badge. So we look forward to you again and bring us some more scenarios. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Representative.